Mali in the year 1324. When most of Europe was still struggling with basic farming and simple villages, something amazing was happening in the heart of Africa. A man was preparing for a journey that would change how the world saw his continent forever. They were completely wrong. In West Africa, there stood one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen. The empire controlled some of the world's richest gold mines. These mines produced so much gold that it seemed endless. But Mali did not just have gold. It also controlled the salt mines in the north. In those days, salt was as valuable as gold because people needed it to preserve their food. He was also very smart about how he used his wealth. The emperor had governors who ruled different parts of the empire. These governors made sure that trade routes were safe and that everyone followed the laws. Mansa Musa was not going to travel like an ordinary person. He was going to show the world the power and wealth of Mali. He gathered together the most amazing caravan in history. 60,000 people joined him on this journey. This included soldiers, servants, merchants, scholars, and holy men. He wanted the world to know that Africa was not a backward continent. He wanted to prove that African kingdoms were just as advanced and powerful as any in the world. What Mansa Musa did during his pilgrimage would be talked about for hundreds of years. Modern experts believe that if Mansa Musa were alive today, his wealth would be worth more than $400 billion. That would make him richer than any person who has ever lived. But his story is about more than just money. It is about a time when Africa was home to some of the greatest civilizations in the world. He would give away so much gold that he would change the economy of entire regions. It was a symbol of power, learning, and achievement that would inspire people for centuries to come. He would crash the gold market in some places and create inflation that lasted for more than 10 years. He wanted to show that Mali was a force to be respected. 12,000 of these people were slaves, and each one carried a golden staff that weighed about 4 pounds. Mansa Musa and his caravan would travel through the Sahara Desert, through Egypt, and then to the holy city of Mecca in Arabia. Along the way, he would meet with other rulers, give away incredible amounts of gold, and leave people amazed by his generosity and wealth. The empire had a strong army that protected the merchants and kept peace in the region. There were hundreds of other camels carrying food, water, and supplies for the long journey across the desert. The line of people and animals stretched for miles across the desert. People who saw this caravan could not believe their eyes. Nothing like this had ever been seen before. This made more traders want to come to Mali, which brought even more wealth. He understood that money alone does not make a great empire. He invested in education, building schools and libraries. He brought scholars from faraway places to teach in his kingdom. The city of Timbuktu became famous all over the world as a place of learning. Students came from Europe, Asia, and other parts of Africa to study there. Merchants in Cairo heard about him and prepared to welcome him. Scholars in Baghdad wrote about him in their books. Even people in Europe began to hear stories about this amazing African emperor. Mali sat perfectly between the gold mines in the south and the salt mines in the north. This made the empire the most important trading center in all of Africa. In 1324, he decided to make the Hajj, the holy pilgrimage to Mecca that every Muslim is supposed to make at least once in their lifetime. This decision would make him the most famous person in the world at that time. The Mali Empire was huge, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the bend of the Niger River in the east. It covered parts of what we now call Mali, Senegal, Niger, Guinea, Gambia, and Burkina Faso. The royal palace in Niamey, the capital city, was filled with treasures from all over the world. Mansa Musa had so much gold that he could afford to be generous with it. He gave gold to visitors, used it to decorate his palaces, and even his servants carried golden staffs. This empire was not just big. This man was not just any ordinary ruler. He was Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali, and he was about to become the most famous African king in history. Mansa Musa lived in a time when many people thought Africa was just a land of simple tribes and empty deserts. The secret to Mali's wealth lay deep in the ground. Mansa Musa understood this better than anyone. He knew that controlling trade was the key to power. Under his rule, Mali became the place where merchants from all over the world came to do business. Traders from North Africa brought horses, copper, and manufactured goods. They traded these for gold, salt, and ivory from the south. Every single trade deal that happened in this region had to go through Mali. This meant that Mansa Musa got a share of everything. The wealth that flowed into Mali was beyond imagination. Gold dust was so common in the empire that people used it like we use coins today. But Mansa Musa was not just rich. The Mali Empire under Mansa Musa was also very well organized. Mansa Musa was also a very religious man. He was a Muslim, and his faith was very important to him. The preparation for this journey was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. The caravan also included 80 camels, and each camel carried 300 pounds of gold dust. As news of this incredible journey spread, people all over North Africa and the Middle East began to talk about the African king who was so rich that he traveled with more gold than entire kingdoms possessed. He was making a statement about Africa and about Mali. Mansa Musa was not just showing off his wealth. The journey to Mecca would take more than a year. But the most incredible part of the story was still to come. This is the story of how one man from West Africa became the richest person in human history. The golden throne of Mali was not just a symbol of wealth. Long before Mansa Musa became the richest man in history, he was just a young prince living in the royal city of Niani. The year was around 1280, and the world was very different from today. There were no cars, no electricity, and no phones. But in the heart of West Africa, something special was happening. A great empire was growing, and young Musa was born right into the center of it all. His enemies laughed at him and thought he would never amount to anything. But Sundiata had a strong spirit and a wise mother who believed in him. Griots were special people who kept the history and traditions of the empire alive. They were like living libraries, memorizing thousands of stories, songs, and poems. They taught young princes about their ancestors and about the great deeds of the past. From the Griots, Musa learned about courage, wisdom, and the responsibility that came with power. His father and the other royal advisors made sure that young princes received the best education possible. Musa learned to read and write in Arabic, which was the language of trade and scholarship in that part of the world. He also learned practical skills that would help him rule an empire. He learned to ride horses and use weapons. He practiced speaking in public and making decisions. He watched the older rulers settle disputes and make important choices. All of this training was preparing him for the day when he might need to lead Mali himself. He studied mathematics, which helped him understand trade and commerce. He learned about geography, so he would know about the lands that Mali traded with. There were the Mandinka people, who were the founders of the empire. Mali was already very rich by the time he was born. The royal family lived in buildings decorated with gold and fine cloth. These mines were located in places called Bambouk and Bure, far to the south of Niani. The miners who worked there were skilled craftsmen who knew how to find gold in the rivers and rocks. They used simple tools but had techniques that had been passed down for generations. The gold they found was so pure and plentiful that it seemed magical. They ate the best food and wore the finest clothes. But Musa also learned that wealth came with responsibility. He saw how the royal family used their riches to help their people, to build schools and mosques, and to support trade. There were the Fulani herders who moved their cattle across the grasslands. He knew how to work with different ethnic groups. He was educated in religion and culture. He had learned from the mistakes and successes of the rulers who came before him. All of this knowledge would soon be put to the test when fate called him to the golden throne of Mali. He learned that a good ruler must be fair to everyone, regardless of their background. He learned that diversity could be a strength if it was managed wisely. He saw how his elders used marriage, trade agreements, and diplomatic meetings to keep peace between different groups. The empire also controlled the salt mines in the north. Salt was incredibly valuable because it was needed to preserve food and keep people healthy. Mali sat right in the middle of the trade routes that connected North Africa with the rest of the continent. Gold came from the south, salt came from the north, and Mali controlled the meeting point. This was why caravans of camels constantly traveled through the empire. This was why merchants from faraway places came to do business in Mali's cities. The salt mines were in the middle of the Sahara Desert, in places so hot and dry that only the toughest people could work there. But the salt they produced was worth its weight in gold. There were the Songhai people who lived along the Niger River. There were the Tuareg nomads who crossed the desert with their camels. Each group had its own customs, languages, and traditions. Mali stretched for thousands of miles. From the Atlantic Ocean to the bend of the Niger River, communication was slow and difficult. It could take months for messages to travel from one end of the empire to the other. Keeping control over such a vast territory required skill, patience, and wisdom. When he finally learned to walk, he became incredibly strong and brave. He united the scattered kingdoms of West Africa into one powerful empire. This was the beginning of Mali, and this was the empire that Musa would one day rule. The religion had come to Mali through the Arab traders who crossed the Sahara Desert. Many of the royal family had become Muslims, including Musa's family. Young Musa learned to pray 5 times a day, to read the Quran, and to follow the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. This religious education would become very important in his later life. The Mali Empire did not appear overnight. It was built by brave warriors and smart leaders over many years. The most important of these leaders was Musa's great-uncle, a man named Sundiata Keita. Sundiata was not just any ordinary king, he was a legend, a hero whose story was told around fires for generations. People called him the Lion King of Mali, and his story was so amazing that it sounded like something from a fairy tale. According to the stories that young Musa heard as a child, Sundiata was born weak and unable to walk. It sat on the banks of the Niger River, which was like a highway for trade and travel. The city was always busy with merchants, travelers, and visitors from distant lands. Young Musa could walk through the markets and hear people speaking different languages. He saw traders from the north bringing horses and copper. He watched merchants from the south carrying gold dust and ivory. This was how he learned about the world beyond Mali. Growing up in the royal palace, young Musa learned these stories from the griots. The city of Niani, where Musa grew up, was unlike anywhere else in the world. The royal palace, where Musa lived, was a place of learning and culture. But Musa's education was not just about books and learning. One of the most important parts of Musa's education was learning about Islam. The Mali Empire that young Musa grew up in was incredibly diverse. It was home to many different tribes and ethnic groups. Learning to understand and respect all these different people was one of the most important lessons of Musa's childhood. The palace where Musa lived was also a place where he learned about wealth and luxury. Young Musa was particularly interested in the stories about the gold mines that made Mali so wealthy. But it was not just gold that made Mali rich. As Musa grew older, he began to understand how all these pieces fit together. The young prince also learned about the challenges that came with ruling such a large and diverse empire. By the time Musa reached adulthood, he had learned everything he needed to know about ruling an empire. He understood trade and commerce. The year 1312 brought shocking news to the royal palace of Niani. Emperor Abu Bakr II, the ruler of Mali, had disappeared without a trace. He had been planning something that no one had ever attempted before. Abu Bakr believed that there was land beyond the great Atlantic Ocean, and he wanted to find it. Against the advice of his counselors, he had gathered a massive fleet of boats and sailed west into the unknown waters. Neither he nor any of his 2,000 men were ever seen again. He had seen how the empire's riches came from controlling trade routes and natural resources. He realized that if Mali became even richer, it would also become more powerful. The empire also controlled the salt trade, which was equally important. Salt was needed to preserve food, especially meat, in the hot African climate. It was also used in many crafts and trades. The Mali Empire was huge, covering an area larger than most modern countries. These messengers traveled on horseback along well-maintained roads, allowing information to move much faster than before. This communication system helped Mansa Musa stay informed about what was happening in distant parts of his empire and respond quickly to any problems. Managing such a vast territory required careful planning and good communication. He began to dream of making Mali famous not just in Africa, but throughout the world. He wanted other rulers to know about Mali's power and sophistication. Merchants began to talk about the African king who was so rich that his pilgrimage would be like nothing ever seen before. The stage was set for Mansa Musa to become the most famous ruler in the medieval world. He wanted scholars and merchants from distant lands to come to Mali and see its wonders. Most importantly, he wanted to fulfill his religious duty as a Muslim by making the pilgrimage to Mecca. Mansa Musa divided the empire into provinces, each ruled by a governor who reported directly to him. Every Muslim who was able was supposed to make this journey at least once in their lifetime. He began gathering resources and people for a caravan that would amaze everyone who saw it. He collected thousands of pounds of gold to give as gifts. He recruited thousands of people to join the journey. He prepared supplies for a trip that would take more than a year to complete. For Mansa Musa, the Hajj would be more than just a religious duty. He understood that wealth was not just about having money. It was about using that money wisely to achieve important goals. The Hajj would cost Mali enormous amounts of gold and resources. But it would also make Mali famous throughout the Muslim world. It would establish trade relationships that would bring wealth back to the empire for generations. It would be a chance to show the world the wealth and power of Mali. It would be an opportunity to establish diplomatic relations with other Muslim rulers. It would be a way to bring honor and recognition to his empire. These governors were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and ensuring that trade flowed smoothly. The salt mines in the northern part of the empire were some of the most valuable in the world. Mansa Musa made sure that these mines were well protected and efficiently managed. Other kingdoms would want to be Mali's friends rather than its enemies. Merchants from distant lands would compete for the chance to trade with Mali. The disappearance of Abu Bakr II left the Mali Empire without a leader. This was a dangerous time for any kingdom. He sent skilled miners to explore new areas where gold might be found. He improved the tools and techniques used in the existing mines. He made sure that the miners were well fed and properly rewarded for their work. Under his leadership, the gold mines of Bambouk and Bur became even more productive than before. Without a strong ruler, enemies might attack, trade might stop, and the empire could fall apart. He was no longer just a prince learning about leadership. He built rest stops where merchants could stay safely during their long journeys. He stationed soldiers along the routes to protect traders from bandits and thieves. He standardized the weights and measures used in different parts of the empire, which made trade easier and more honest. These improvements made more merchants want to trade with Mali, which brought even more wealth to the empire. He was now the Mansa, the emperor of one of the world's most powerful empires. The word Mansa meant King of Kings, and it was a title that carried enormous responsibility. From that day forward, he would be known as Mansa Musa, but Mali was lucky. There was a man ready to take the throne, a man who had been preparing for this moment his whole life. In those days, becoming emperor was not always peaceful. He understood that an empire built only on fear and violence would not last long. Instead, he chose to use diplomacy, trade, and strategic marriages to strengthen his position. He made alliances with powerful families within the empire. He arranged marriages between his relatives and the children of important governors. He showed respect for local customs and traditions, which made people more likely to accept his rule. Other members of the royal family might challenge his right to rule. Neighboring kingdoms might see the change in leadership as a chance to attack. Enemy tribes might try to rebel against Mali's authority. But Musa was smart and prepared. He had learned from the griots about how previous rulers had dealt with similar challenges. That man was Musa, and he was about to become the greatest ruler in African history. When Musa heard the news about Abu Bakr's disappearance, he knew that his life was about to change forever. The first thing Mansa Musa had to do was secure his position as ruler. Unlike many rulers of his time, Mansa Musa did not believe that war was always the best solution. One of Mansa Musa's first major decisions was to focus on expanding Mali's wealth rather than just its territory. The new emperor immediately began working to improve Mali's gold production. But Mansa Musa understood that gold was only part of Mali's wealth. The emperor also worked to improve the trade routes that connected different parts of Africa. One of Mansa Musa's most important innovations was the creation of a more organized government system. The emperor also established a system of messengers who carried news and orders between different parts of the empire. As Mansa Musa's wealth grew, so did his ambitions. The idea of the Hajj, the holy pilgrimage to Mecca, had been in Mansa Musa's mind for years. But Mansa Musa was not planning an ordinary pilgrimage. He was planning the most spectacular journey in history. The preparations for the Hajj showed Mansa Musa's genius as a leader. As the preparations continued, people throughout Mali began to realize that their emperor was planning something unprecedented. Word spread to neighboring kingdoms and distant lands. Under Mansa Musa's rule, the Mali Empire became the most powerful economic force in medieval Africa. The emperor understood something that many rulers of his time did not. True power did not come just from having a strong army or controlling a lot of land. To the south of the empire lay the gold fields of Bambouk and Bure. These were some of the richest gold deposits in the world. The gold was found in rivers and streams where it had been washed down from the mountains over thousands of years. Local miners had learned special techniques for finding and collecting this precious metal. They used simple tools like wooden pans and baskets, but their methods were very effective. True power came from controlling the things that everyone needed and wanted. In Mali's case, those things were gold and salt. He realized that Mali sat in the perfect position between the gold fields in the south and the salt mines in the north. Every trader who wanted to exchange gold for salt had to pass through Mali. This gave the empire enormous power and wealth. He established markets in cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Walata. These cities became bustling centers of commerce where merchants from all over Africa and the Middle East came to do business. In these markets, traders from the north would bring salt, horses, copper, and manufactured goods. Traders from the south would bring gold, ivory, and slaves. Mali's banks could handle large transactions and provide credit to merchants who needed to buy goods before they could sell them. The banks also exchanged different types of currency, making it easier for foreign merchants to do business in Mali. Gold dust was used as currency in many transactions, and the banks had special scales and measures to ensure that deals were fair. Located near the bend of the Niger River, Timbuktu was perfectly positioned to serve as a meeting point for traders from different parts of Africa. Under Mansa Musa's rule, the city grew rapidly and became famous throughout the known world. He built schools and libraries in the city and invited scholars from all over the Muslim world to come and teach. The University of Sankar in Timbuktu became one of the most important centers of learning in the world, attracting students from many different countries. The royal treasury was filled with gold, silver, and precious stones. The emperor's palace was decorated with the finest materials from around the world. He understood that wealth was a tool that could be used to achieve greater goals. He used Mali's riches to build infrastructure that would benefit his people. He constructed roads and bridges that made travel easier and safer. He built mosques and schools that served the spiritual and educational needs of his subjects. The empire became so wealthy that gold dust was used as everyday currency. Merchants from around the world competed for the chance to trade with Mali. The cities of the empire became cosmopolitan centers where people from many different cultures lived and worked together. All of this prosperity was built on Mansa Musa's vision of how to use Mali's natural resources to create lasting wealth and power. He sponsored art and literature that celebrated Mali's culture and achievements. Mansa Musa could afford to be generous with his wealth, giving gifts to visitors and supporting public works projects throughout his empire. He began to dream of using his riches to achieve something that would make him famous throughout the world. That dream was the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that would showcase Mali's wealth and power to the entire Muslim world. He sent gifts and ambassadors to kingdoms in North Africa and the Middle East. These diplomatic efforts helped to protect Mali from invasion and opened up new opportunities for trade. Other rulers began to see Mali as an important ally rather than just a distant African kingdom. Merchants from as far away as Europe and Asia knew about Timbuktu and wanted to trade there. All of these trades had to be approved by Mali's officials, and the empire collected taxes on every transaction. Teams of miners would go to the rivers early in the morning when the water was clear. They would scoop up sand and gravel from the riverbed and wash it carefully in their pans. Before this, different regions used different systems, which made trade confusing and often unfair. With standard weights and measures, merchants could trade more easily and honestly. This made more traders want to come to Mali, which brought even more wealth to the empire. Salt was essential for preserving food, especially in the hot climate of Africa. Without salt, meat would spoil quickly and people would get sick. The salt mines of Mali were located in the northern part of the empire, in the middle of the Sahara Desert. These mines were in places so hot and dry that working there was extremely difficult. The heavy gold would sink to the bottom, while the lighter sand and stones would wash away. He stationed soldiers along the major trade routes to protect merchants from bandits and thieves. He built fortified rest stops where caravans could stay safely during their long journeys. He established a system of guides who knew the desert routes and could help merchants navigate safely through dangerous areas. It was hard work that required skill and patience, but the results were amazing. Instead of working by cool rivers, they worked in blazing desert heat. They had to dig deep holes in the ground to reach the salt deposits. The salt was so pure and white that it looked like snow. The miners would cut it into blocks and load them onto camels for transport. Each block of salt was heavy and valuable, worth its weight in gold in some parts of Africa. Each day, the miners would collect gold dust and small nuggets that would eventually make their way to the royal treasury. The geography of West Africa had given Mali a perfect position to become incredibly wealthy. The gold mining process was carefully organized under Mansa Musa's leadership. But gold was only half of Mali's wealth. The other half came from salt, which was just as valuable in those days. The salt miners faced challenges that were completely different from the gold miners. Mansa Musa's genius was in understanding how to bring these two valuable resources together. The emperor created a system that made Mali the most important trading center in West Africa. Mansa Musa also created a standardized system of weights and measures throughout his empire. The emperor established a sophisticated banking system that was more advanced than anything in Europe at the time. To protect all of this trade, Mansa Musa created a network of security throughout his empire. The city of Timbuktu became the crown jewel of Mali's trading empire. Timbuktu was not just a place for buying and selling goods. It also became a center of learning and culture. Mansa Musa invested heavily in education and scholarship. The wealth that flowed into Mali from all of this trade was beyond imagination. But Mansa Musa was not just interested in accumulating wealth for its own sake. The emperor also used his wealth to establish diplomatic relationships with other powerful rulers. The success of Mali's economy under Mansa Musa's rule was remarkable. As Mansa Musa's wealth grew, so did his ambitions. In the year 1324, Mansa Musa began the journey that would make him the most famous person in the medieval world. This was not just any ordinary trip. This was the Hajj, the holy pilgrimage to Mecca that every Muslim was supposed to make at least once in their lifetime. But when Mansa Musa decided to make this journey, he planned something so spectacular that people would still be talking about it hundreds of years later. He was the emperor of one of the world's richest empires, and he wanted everyone to know it. He gathered together the most amazing caravan that had ever been assembled. The scale of this expedition was beyond anything that anyone had ever seen before. Each of these 12,000 slaves carried a golden staff that weighed about 4 pounds. This meant that the slaves alone were carrying almost 50,000 pounds of gold just in their staffs. The sight of 12,000 people walking across the desert, each carrying a gleaming golden staff, was something that no one who saw it would ever forget. People who lived along the route came out to watch in amazement as this river of people and animals passed by their villages. Many had never seen so many people traveling together at one time. The caravan had to cross the entire Sahara Desert, one of the most difficult and dangerous places on Earth. During the day, the desert was incredibly hot, with temperatures that could kill a person. At night, it became freezing cold. There was very little water, and sandstorms could bury a caravan in minutes. But Mansa Musa had planned carefully for all of these challenges. The sound of 60,000 people walking, talking, and singing, along with hundreds of camels and other animals, could be heard from far away. The preparations for the Hajj took months to complete. Mansa Musa was not going to travel like an ordinary pilgrim. During this time, he met with Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad and other important leaders. These meetings were not just social visits. They were important diplomatic events that helped establish relationships between Mali and the powerful kingdoms of the Middle East. The emperor gave away so much gold that he completely changed the economy of the entire region. He gave gold to poor people on the streets. He gave gold to religious leaders and scholars. He gave gold to government officials and merchants. He bought supplies and souvenirs, paying prices that were far higher than anything was actually worth. In every place they visited, local rulers and merchants tried to establish trade relationships with Mali. Everyone wanted to do business with the empire that had produced such incredible wealth. Mansa Musa was showing that Mali was not just a distant African kingdom, but a major power that deserved respect and recognition. He had not only fulfilled his religious duty as a Muslim, but he had also made Mali famous throughout the known world. People from Europe to Asia had heard about the wealthy African king and his amazing empire. He prayed at the holy sites, walked around the Kaaba, and participated in all of the traditional ceremonies. Mali was now recognized as one of the great powers of the medieval world. Trade relationships established during the journey would bring wealth back to the empire for generations. It established Mansa Musa as the richest and most generous ruler of his time, and it put the continent of Africa on the map of world civilization. Most importantly, Mansa Musa had proven that Africa was home to civilizations that were just as sophisticated and powerful as any in the world. But even in Mecca, people were more amazed by his wealth than by his religious devotion. Stories about the African emperor who traveled with more gold than entire kingdoms possessed spread throughout the Muslim world. Suddenly, there was so much gold in circulation that it became much less valuable. This created inflation that affected prices of everything from food to clothing. The economic impact of Mansa Musa's visit lasted for more than 10 years. Even a decade later, people in Cairo were still talking about the African king who had given away so much gold that he changed their entire economy. This was gold that Mansa Musa planned to give away as gifts during his journey. The total amount of gold carried by these camels was 24,000 pounds. In addition to the gold, there were hundreds of other camels carrying food, water, tents, and other supplies needed for the long journey across the Sahara Desert. The long line of people carrying golden staffs, the camels loaded with gold, and the emperor himself riding in magnificent robes created a spectacle that left everyone speechless. The people of Cairo lined the streets to watch this amazing procession. Many had heard stories about the wealth of African kingdoms, but seeing it with their own eyes was completely different. These guides knew where to find water in the desert and how to avoid the worst dangers. The caravan traveled mostly at night when it was cooler and rested during the hottest part of the day. They followed ancient trade routes that had been used for hundreds of years by merchants crossing the desert. This was more people than lived in most cities at that time. When news reached Cairo that the richest king in Africa was approaching with an enormous caravan loaded with gold, the entire city went crazy with excitement. The Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, al-Nasir Muhammad, prepared a grand welcome for his distinguished visitor. The caravan included soldiers to protect the group, servants to take care of daily needs, merchants to handle trade along the way, scholars to provide education and entertainment, and holy men to lead prayers and religious ceremonies. There were also many members of the royal family and important officials from the Mali Empire. 60,000 people joined Mansa Musa on this incredible journey. Among these 60,000 people, 12,000 were slaves, but these were not ordinary slaves doing hard labor. The caravan also included 80 camels, and each camel was loaded with 300 pounds of pure gold dust. When this enormous caravan began to move, it stretched for miles across the landscape. The journey from Mali to Mecca was more than 3,000 miles long. The emperor had hired the best guides in Africa to lead the caravan along the safest routes. The first major stop on the journey was in Egypt, in the great city of Cairo, when Mansa Musa entered Cairo. The sight was unlike anything the people there had ever witnessed. Mansa Musa stayed in Cairo for several months. But the most incredible thing that happened in Cairo was Mansa Musa's generosity with his gold. The amount of gold that Mansa Musa gave away in Cairo was so enormous that it crashed the gold market throughout the Middle East. from Cairo. The caravan continued east toward Mecca along the way. They stopped in other important cities where Mansa Musa continued to amaze people with his wealth and generosity. When Mansa Musa finally reached Mecca, he completed all of the religious duties required for the Hajj. The pilgrimage took more than a year to complete. When Mansa Musa finally returned to Mali, he had accomplished something incredible. The Hajj had cost Mali enormous amounts of gold and resources. But it had also achieved exactly what Mansa Musa had hoped. The pilgrimage of 1324 to 1325 became the most famous journey in medieval history. Being the richest man in the world did not make Mansa Musa's life easy. In fact, his enormous wealth and vast empire brought him problems that most rulers could never imagine. The Mali Empire was so large that it covered an area bigger than most modern countries. Mali stretched from the Atlantic Ocean in the west all the way to the bend of the Niger River in the east. From north to south, it covered the distance from the edge of the Sahara Desert down to the tropical forests. In those days, there were no phones, no radios, and no fast ways to send messages. A letter from one end of the empire to the other could take months to arrive. Managing such a huge territory was like trying to control a dozen different kingdoms at the same time. Each region had its own challenges, and each challenge required Mansa Musa's careful attention. The Mossi were expert horsemen who could move very quickly across the landscape. They would attack suddenly and then retreat just as fast. The Tuareg were desert peoples who lived in the Sahara and made their living by controlling trade routes. They had been crossing the desert with their camel caravans for hundreds of years, and they knew the desert better than anyone else. This was a serious problem for Mansa Musa because Mali's wealth depended on safe trade routes. If merchants were afraid to travel through Mali's territory, they would find other routes, and Mali would lose its most important source of income. Mali was home to many different ethnic groups, each with their own traditions and beliefs. While Mansa Musa and many of the ruling class were Muslims, most of the common people still followed traditional African religions. This created tension and sometimes conflict. Mansa Musa had to maintain a constant military presence in the desert to protect the caravans, which was expensive and difficult. Some Tuareg groups were allies of Mali and helped protect the trade routes. But others saw Mali's wealth as an opportunity for raiding and theft. Mali's armies were better equipped and larger, but they were also slower and less flexible. The famous Hajj pilgrimage that had made him famous around the world had also cost Mali enormous amounts of gold. While the pilgrimage had brought diplomatic benefits and increased trade, it had also drained the royal treasury. Mansa Musa had given away so much gold during his journey that even Mali's vast wealth felt the impact. Many times, by the time Mali's soldiers arrived at a place that had been attacked, the Mossi raiders were already long gone. This meant increasing gold production, expanding trade, and being more careful about spending. Rivers dried up, crops failed, and many people faced starvation. Mansa Musa had to organize massive relief efforts, distributing food from the royal stores and arranging for grain to be brought from other regions. This was expensive and logistically complicated, requiring careful coordination across the vast empire. The emperor had to balance his desire to be generous and build impressive monuments with the practical need to keep enough wealth to run the empire effectively. Powerful nobles and government officials often had their own agendas and interests. Some wanted more power for themselves, others wanted to change government policies, and still others plotted against their rivals. Sometimes these merchants had disagreements about prices, quality of goods, or trading practices. These disputes could escalate into larger conflicts if they were not handled carefully. Mansa Musa often had to serve as a judge in these cases, making decisions that would keep trade flowing smoothly. Mansa Musa had to stay alert to these political schemes while maintaining the loyalty of the people he needed to help him govern. He learned to delegate authority to trusted governors while maintaining overall control. He used diplomacy when possible and force when necessary. He balanced competing interests and managed to keep his vast empire together during his entire reign. His ability to overcome these obstacles showed that he was not just the richest man in the world, but also one of the most capable leaders of his time. Droughts could destroy crops and kill livestock, leading to famine and suffering among his people. Floods could wash away villages and disrupt trade routes. Diseases could spread quickly through the empire, especially in the crowded trading cities. When these disasters struck, people looked to their emperor for help, and Mansa Musa had to use his wealth and resources to provide relief. In royal families, there were often disputes about succession. Different family members might believe they had the best claim to the throne, and these disagreements could lead to civil wars that would tear the empire apart. Mansa Musa had to carefully manage relationships within his own family while preparing his chosen successor to take over when the time came. The biggest problem Mansa Musa faced was the sheer size of his empire. They believed that having one religion would make the empire more unified and easier to govern. But Mansa Musa was wise enough to see that forcing people to change their religion would probably cause rebellions and make his problems worse. Instead, he tried to find a balance between promoting Islam and respecting traditional beliefs. This slow communication made governing very difficult. When problems arose in distant parts of the empire, Mansa Musa might not hear about them until weeks or months later. Traditional African religions had different rules about marriage, inheritance, and social behavior than Islam did. Sometimes these differences led to disputes that Mansa Musa had to resolve. He had to be careful not to favor one group over another, or he would risk losing the loyalty of large parts of his population. By that time, small problems could become big disasters. Rebellions could spread, trade routes could be disrupted, and enemies could attack before the emperor even knew there was trouble. The Mossi people were fierce warriors who lived in what is now Burkina Faso. They had their own strong kingdoms and did not want to be controlled by Mali. Throughout Mansa Musa's reign, the Mossi launched raids into Mali's territory. They would attack villages, steal cattle and gold, and then disappear back into their own lands before Mali's armies could respond. Mansa Musa had to create a system of governors and messengers to help him stay informed, but even this system had its limits. One of the most persistent threats to Mali came from the Mossi kingdoms to the south. Fighting the Mossi was especially difficult because they used different military tactics than Mali's armies were used to. In the north, Mansa Musa faced a different kind of problem with the Tuareg nomads. The Tuareg raiders would attack merchant caravans traveling through the desert, stealing gold, salt, and other valuable goods. Perhaps the most complicated challenge Mansa Musa faced was managing the religious and cultural differences within his empire. Some of Mansa Musa's Muslim advisors wanted him to force everyone in the empire to convert to Islam. This balancing act was not easy. The emperor also faced economic challenges that came from his own success. After returning from the Hajj, Mansa Musa had to work hard to rebuild Mali's financial reserves. Natural disasters also posed serious challenges to Mansa Musa's rule. One particularly difficult period came when a severe drought hit the region for several years in a row. Family problems also caused headaches for Mansa Musa. As emperor, he had to think about who would rule after him. The emperor also had to deal with the constant pressure of palace politics. Trade disputes were another ongoing challenge. Mali's wealth depended on maintaining good relationships with merchants from many different regions and cultures. Despite all these challenges, Mansa Musa proved to be a skilled and effective ruler. While Mansa Musa was famous for his incredible wealth, his greatest achievement was not the gold he accumulated, but the knowledge he helped spread throughout his empire. The emperor understood something that many rich rulers did not. Gold could buy many things, but wisdom and learning were treasures that lasted forever. When Mansa Musa first became emperor, Timbuktu was already an important trading center. But the emperor had a vision for something much greater. He wanted to turn this desert city into a place where the greatest minds of his time would come to teach and learn. He wanted Timbuktu to be as famous for its schools and libraries as it was for its gold markets. Under his leadership, Mali became not just the richest empire in Africa, but also one of the most educated and cultured places in the world. The transformation began with Timbuktu, a city that would become legendary throughout the world. Young men came from Egypt, Morocco, Spain, and even some from as far away as Central Asia. They came to study Islamic law, theology, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature. It contained nearly 1 million books and manuscripts, making it larger than most university libraries in Europe at that time. The books were written in Arabic and covered every subject imaginable. There were copies of the Quran and Islamic religious texts, but also works on science, philosophy, history, poetry, and mathematics. Many of these manuscripts were copied by hand by skilled scribes who worked in the library. The university had professors who were experts in every field of knowledge known at the time. Some classes had hundreds of students, while others were small groups where students could work closely with master teachers. He made sure that both rich and poor children had opportunities to learn. The emperor believed that an educated population would make Mali stronger and more prosperous. For the first time, large numbers of African students had access to the same quality of education that was available in the great cities of the Middle East and Europe. Many of these students became teachers themselves, spreading knowledge even further throughout the region. Many of the mosques had schools attached to them where children learned to read and write. The emperor made sure that these mosque schools were well funded and had qualified teachers. The royal palace became a center of cultural activity where the best artists and writers in Africa gathered to share their talents. The emperor himself was said to be a patron of poetry and music, often hosting evening gatherings where scholars and artists would perform their latest works. He encouraged the development of new techniques in agriculture, mining, and crafts. Farmers learned better ways to grow crops in the challenging climate of West Africa. Miners developed more efficient methods for extracting gold and salt. Craftsmen created beautiful works of art and practical items that were traded throughout the region. The most famous of these was the Gingerbread Mosque in Timbuktu, which was built using a distinctive style that combined Islamic and African architectural traditions. The mosque was made of mud, brick, and wood, but it was decorated with intricate patterns and designs that made it one of the most beautiful buildings in West Africa. The trained administrators and judges who came from Mali's schools helped the empire run more efficiently. The doctors and teachers improved the health and welfare of the population. The manuscripts in Timbuktu's libraries contain not just Islamic learning but also records of African history, science, and culture that might otherwise have been lost. Many of these manuscripts survive for centuries and continue to provide valuable information about medieval African civilization. The artists and writers created works that brought pride and unity to the diverse peoples of the empire. It had become a beacon of learning and culture that attracted scholars and students from around the world. The emperor had proven that African civilizations could compete with any in the world when it came to education, scholarship, and cultural achievement. Scholars in Cairo and Baghdad wrote about the learning and culture they found in West Africa. European travelers who visited Mali were amazed by the sophistication of its cities and schools. The reputation of Timbuktu as a center of learning spread so widely that it became a symbol of wisdom and knowledge that is still remembered today. While he supported the introduction of Arabic writing and Islamic learning, he did not want traditional African culture to be forgotten. He made sure that the griots continued to tell the ancient stories and sing the traditional songs that preserved the history and values of the African peoples. This created a unique blend of cultures that made Mali's civilization especially rich and diverse. Others became government officials, judges, merchants, and doctors who used their education to serve their communities. Doctors in Timbuktu and other cities learned from both Islamic medical texts and traditional African healing practices. They performed surgeries, treated diseases, and developed medicines that were effective for the health challenges of their region. Some of these medical techniques were so advanced that they would not be matched in Europe for several centuries. Mansa Musa began by inviting scholars from all over the Muslim world to come to Timbuktu. He offered them generous salaries and comfortable homes if they would move to Mali and establish schools. Scholars from Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, and Cordoba heard about this opportunity and made the long journey to West Africa. The most famous of these was the University of Sankar, which became one of the greatest centers of learning in the medieval world. The university was not just one building but a complex of schools, libraries, and dormitories that could house thousands of students and teachers. Many of them were amazed to discover that this African city was more advanced and sophisticated than they had expected. The emperor also brought architects and builders from North Africa and the Middle East to construct magnificent buildings for education. The University of Sankar attracted students from across Africa and beyond. The library at Sankar was one of the wonders of the medieval world. Mansa Musa did not stop with just one university. He established schools throughout his empire, from small village schools that taught basic reading and writing to advanced academies in major cities. The impact of this educational revolution was felt throughout West Africa. Mansa Musa also supported the arts and literature. He brought poets, musicians, and artists to his court and gave them the resources they needed to create beautiful works. The architectural achievements of Mansa Musa's reign were equally impressive. He commissioned the construction of magnificent mosques throughout his empire. These mosques served not just as places of worship, but also as community centers where people gathered for education, discussion, and social activities. Mansa Musa's support for learning extended to practical subjects as well as academic ones. The emperor also promoted the preservation of African oral traditions. The medical knowledge that developed in Mali during this period was particularly advanced. The scholarly achievements of Mali during Mansa Musa's reign were recognized throughout the medieval world. The emperor's investment in education and culture had practical benefits as well. Perhaps most importantly, the educational renaissance that Mansa Musa created helped preserve knowledge for future generations. By the end of Mansa Musa's reign, Mali had become more than just a wealthy empire. As Mansa Musa entered the final years of his reign, he began to think more about the future than the present. The emperor was getting older, and he knew that someday another ruler would sit on the golden throne of Mali. This thought filled him with both pride and worry. He was proud of everything he had accomplished, but he was worried about whether his successors would be able to maintain the great empire he had built. In royal families, choosing the next ruler was often complicated and sometimes led to civil wars between different family members who wanted power. Mansa Musa wanted to avoid this problem, so he spent years observing and testing various members of his family to see who would make the best emperor. The emperor spent much of his later years working to ensure that Mali would remain strong after his death. He knew that many great empires in history had fallen apart when their founders died because they had not prepared properly for the transition of power. Mansa Musa was determined that this would not happen to Mali. He began carefully planning for the succession and making sure that the empire's institutions would survive even without his personal leadership. The most famous of these was the Djingueber Mosque in Timbuktu. This magnificent building took many years to complete, and Mansa Musa wanted to see it finished before he died. The main structure was built from mud bricks, but these were not ordinary bricks. They were specially made using a technique that made them incredibly strong and durable. The mosque also featured wooden support beams that were carved with intricate patterns and decorations. The mosque was built in a style that had never been seen before, combining Islamic architectural traditions with African design elements. The building could hold thousands of worshippers, and its tall towers could be seen from miles away. The mosque became a symbol of Mali's power and sophistication, and it attracted visitors from all over the Muslim world. He constructed new palaces for the royal family, built additional schools and libraries, and improved the infrastructure of major cities throughout the empire. Trade relationships that had been established during his famous Hajj continued to bring wealth to the empire. Other African rulers looked to Mali as an example of what their own kingdoms might achieve with wise leadership and good management. These projects provided jobs for thousands of workers and demonstrated that Mali remained prosperous and powerful even as the emperor aged. Rather than trying to conquer new lands, he focused on making sure that the existing empire was well defended and properly governed. He strengthened the military garrisons in border regions and improved the communication systems that allowed him to stay in touch with distant parts of the empire. Even today, more than 600 years later, the Djingueber Mosque still stands in Timbuktu and is considered one of the architectural wonders of Africa. The major military campaigns of his earlier years were over, and the empire was secure from external threats. The economy continued to thrive, with gold and salt trade bringing steady wealth to the royal treasury. He continued to meet with advisors, make important decisions, and travel to different parts of the empire to stay in touch with his subjects. The emperor was known for his accessibility and his willingness to listen to the concerns of ordinary people, as well as powerful nobles. The educational and cultural institutions that the emperor had established were flourishing and attracting students and scholars from around the world. But choosing him was only the first step. Mansa Musa then spent several years teaching Magan everything he needed to know about ruling an empire. During that time, he had transformed a wealthy kingdom into the richest and most powerful empire in Africa. He had made Mali famous throughout the world and had proven that African civilizations could compete with any in terms of wealth, learning, and cultural achievement. He made sure that these routes remained safe and well maintained. He negotiated agreements with tribal leaders and local rulers to ensure that merchants could travel safely through their territories. The empire he had built, the institutions he had created, and the example he had set continued to shape the history of West Africa for centuries to come. His reign had proven that African rulers could be just as successful and sophisticated as any in the world, and his legacy would inspire future generations of African leaders. The empire remained stable and continued to prosper for many years after his death. The institutions and systems that he had created proved to be strong, enough to survive the change in leadership and to provide continuity for the Mali Empire. He also continued to invest in the infrastructure that supported trade, building new rest stops and improving existing ones. He understood that Mali's continued prosperity depended partly on maintaining good relationships with neighboring kingdoms and with the major powers of North Africa and the Middle East. The emperor spent considerable time and resources on diplomatic missions and exchanging gifts and ambassadors with other rulers. He spent more time in prayer and religious study. He increased his charitable giving and supported the construction of additional mosques throughout the empire. The emperor wanted to be remembered not just as a wealthy and powerful ruler, but also as a devout Muslim who had used his position to promote his faith. The young prince learned about military strategy, diplomacy, trade, religion, and the complex art of keeping different groups of people happy and loyal. He created clear laws and procedures for how decisions should be made and how disputes should be resolved. He established a council of advisors who would help guide the new emperor. He made sure that the military, the treasury, and the administrative system were all well organized and led by capable people. Mansa Musa made sure that Magan met with governors from all parts of the empire and understood the challenges they faced. One of Mansa Musa's most important decisions was choosing and training his successor. The emperor eventually chose his son Magan to be his successor. During this period, Mansa Musa also worked to strengthen the government institutions that would help his successor rule effectively. The emperor also focused on completing some of the great construction projects that he had started earlier in his reign. The construction of the Jingerbur Mosque was a massive undertaking that required workers and materials from all over the empire. When the mosque was finally completed, it was unlike anything that had ever been built in West Africa. Mansa Musa also completed several other important building projects during his final years. In his later years, Mansa Musa became increasingly focused on diplomatic relationships with other rulers. The diplomatic efforts of Mansa Musa's later years were quite successful. Mali was recognized throughout the known world as a major power that deserved respect. During this period, Mansa Musa also worked to consolidate the territorial gains that Mali had made during his reign. The emperor paid special attention to the trade routes that were so crucial to Mali's economy. As Mansa Musa grew older, he also became more concerned with his spiritual life and his legacy as a Muslim ruler. The final years of Mansa Musa's reign were marked by relative peace and stability. Contemporary accounts from this period suggest that Mansa Musa remained actively involved in governing the empire until near the end of his life. When Mansa Musa died around 1337, he had ruled Mali for about 25 years. The transition of power to his son Magan went smoothly, exactly as Mansa Musa had planned. The death of Mansa Musa marked the end of an era, but it was not the end of his influence. More than 600 years have passed since Mansa Musa died, but his story continues to amaze and inspire people around the world. The emperor who once ruled the Mali Empire from his golden throne has become more than just a historical figure. He has become a symbol of African achievement, and a reminder that the continent was once home to some of the greatest civilizations in human history. European mapmakers who heard about his incredible journey began including him on their maps of the world. The most famous of these was the Catalan Atlas, created in 1375, which showed Mansa Musa sitting on his throne in West Africa, holding a large piece of gold. This was one of the first times that an African ruler had been depicted on a European map, and it showed that Europeans recognized Mali as an important and powerful kingdom. The impact of Mansa Musa's famous pilgrimage to Mecca was felt for centuries after his death. They show that African scholars were working on advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy at a time when most Europeans still believed that Africa was inhabited only by primitive tribes. These manuscripts prove that Mansa Musa's investment in education and learning created an intellectual tradition that lasted for generations. The Djingueber Mosque in Timbuktu, which was built during his reign, still stands and continues to serve the local community. The mosque has been recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site because of its historical and architectural importance. Some were destroyed by wars and invasions. Others fell victim to the harsh climate of the Sahara region, and still others were simply abandoned as cities declined and populations moved elsewhere. But archaeologists continued to discover new evidence of the wealth and sophistication of the Mali Empire, including ruins of palaces, mosques, and other important buildings. It represents a unique style of building that combines Islamic and African traditions and shows the sophisticated level of craftsmanship that existed in medieval Mali. For many years, history books written by Europeans largely ignored African achievements and contributions to world civilization. These calculations are difficult because the economic systems of the 14th century were so different from those of today. But most experts agree that if Mansa Musa were alive today, his wealth would be worth hundreds of billions of dollars, making him far richer than any person currently alive. They portrayed Africa as a continent without significant kingdoms, cities, or cultural achievements. His reign showed that true leadership involves more than just accumulating wealth and power. Mansa Musa used his resources to build schools, libraries, and other institutions that benefited his people and lasted long after his death. He invested in education and culture rather than just military conquest. He promoted trade and diplomacy rather than relying only on force. The Mali Empire became wealthy not through conquest alone but by controlling trade routes and creating conditions that encouraged merchants from different regions to do business. This lesson is relevant for modern African countries that are working to develop their economies and improve their people's standard of living. Some critics point out that his wealth was built partly on the slave trade and that many of the people who joined his famous pilgrimage were enslaved. This reminds us that even great historical figures lived in times when practices that we now consider wrong were common and accepted. The country that was once the center of one of the world's richest empires is now one of the poorest nations on earth. This contrast highlights how much can change over the centuries and reminds us that prosperity and power are not permanent. It also shows the importance of understanding historical figures in the context of their own time while still learning from both their achievements and their failures. The rediscovery of Mansa Musa's story has helped to challenge these misconceptions and to show that Africa has a rich and complex history. It is about remarkable people from every continent who built great civilizations and left lasting legacies. The Golden Emperor of Mali remains one of the most compelling examples of African achievement and continues to challenge stereotypes about what Africa was capable of in the medieval world. Young people around the world are fascinated by the idea of someone who was so wealthy that his generosity could crash the gold market of entire regions. His story proves that their ancestors created great civilizations and achieved remarkable things. It shows that Africa has always been capable of producing world-class leaders and that the continent's current challenges do not define its potential. Videos, articles, and social media posts about Mansa Musa regularly go viral, introducing his story to new generations. The legend of Mansa Musa's wealth grew larger with each telling. It is about the proof he provided that African civilizations could compete with any in the world. It is about the educational and cultural institutions he built that preserve knowledge for future generations. It is about the example he set of leadership that combined power with wisdom, wealth with generosity, and success with responsibility. Merchants who traveled to West Africa brought back stories of cities filled with gold and of an empire so rich that even ordinary people use gold dust as everyday money. The University of Sankar continued to attract students and scholars for centuries after his death. The library in Timbuktu preserved hundreds of thousands of manuscripts that contain not just Islamic learning but also records of African history, science, literature, and culture. They point to his success in building a prosperous, educated, and respected civilization as proof that African nations can achieve great things when they are well governed and when they invest in their people's education and development. These stories spread throughout Europe and the Middle East, creating an image of Africa as a land of incredible wealth and opportunity. And 16th centuries, they were partly motivated by the stories they had heard about the gold of Mali and other African kingdoms. They hoped to find the source of this legendary wealth and to establish trade relationships with the powerful rulers of West Africa. In this way, Mansa Musa's reputation continued to shape history long after his death. His story helps students understand that medieval Africa was home to sophisticated civilizations that were just as advanced as those in Europe and Asia. This has been particularly important for African and African American students who can take pride in this example of African success and leadership. This image influenced European thinking about Africa for hundreds of years. When European explorers began sailing along the West African coast in the 5th-10th, the educational and cultural institutions that Mansa Musa created in Timbuktu and other cities of Mali had a lasting impact on West African civilization. Many of these manuscripts survived into modern times and have provided historians with invaluable information about medieval African civilization. The architectural legacy of Mansa Musa can still be seen today in the cities of Mali. Unfortunately, many of the other buildings and monuments from Mansa Musa's time have not survived as well. In modern times, Mansa Musa has become an important figure in discussions about African history and identity. Today, Mansa Musa is taught about in schools around the world as an example of African achievement and leadership. Modern economists and historians have tried to calculate exactly how wealthy Mansa Musa was compared to rich people of today. This comparison with modern billionaires has made Mansa Musa's story popular on social media and in popular culture. The legacy of Mansa Musa also provides important lessons for modern leaders. Modern African leaders often look to Mansa Musa as an example of the kind of leadership that Africa needs today. The story of Mansa Musa also highlights the importance of trade and economic cooperation in building successful societies. However, the legacy of Mansa Musa is not without controversy. The ongoing conflicts and challenges in modern Mali make Mansa Musa's legacy particularly poignant. Despite these modern challenges, the memory of Mansa Musa continues to inspire hope and pride among the people of West Africa. The eternal golden legacy of Mansa Musa is not just about the gold he possessed or the wealth he displayed. In classrooms around the world, teachers use the story of Mansa Musa to help students understand that history is not just about European kings and queens or Asian emperors.